Great. So welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this SDG for All, Earth for All session from New York and the Science Summit, co-organized by the Club of Rome, the Club of Rome Austria, Uninetz Austria, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Till Kelloff. I'm Program Director of the Club of Rome and will facilitate the first part of this session. It has now been over 50 years since the Club of Rome warned of unlimited material growth on a finite planet in the study The Limits to Growth. And today we know that we're not only exceeding the carrying capacity of our planet, and we have transgressed 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, but we also know that in addition to that, we're confronted with a lot of social crises. We know that today there might not only be limits to growth, but also limits to inequality, which is polarizing our societies and leading to dysfunctionalities. This was the start, the approach, and a holistic view of the Earth for All project, which started 3 years ago. But the launch of the Earth for All book happened exactly 1 year ago today in New York at a similar event at the Science Summit. And what Earth for All was a collaboration of the Club of Rome, the Potsdam Institute, Stockholm Resilience Center, Norwegian Business School, to look at possible pathways to get us out of the poly crisis, and we'll hear about that more in a second. But the book was not only a prevention of disaster, or let's run away from apocalypse, but it was a vision for a world delivering well-being for all within planetary boundaries. And that was a similar promise which was given 8 years ago when the SDGs were adopted. But as Secretary General Guterres expressed earlier this week, instead of leaving no one behind, we risk leaving the SDGs behind. And while the SDGs have been a remarkable achievement and agreement between states, we see today that we are not on track on implementing them. And this is what the session will be about. We will discuss the global vision of Earth for All. We will discuss the implementation of the SDGs, and we will zoom in 2 countries that are pilots in our implementation of national engagement plans of Earth for All, particularly Austria and Kenya. So we are very much looking forward to the session. We will start with an introduction from Earth for All to SDGs for All. And I'm pleased to introduce Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, many hats, but most importantly for today, co-president of the Club of Rome, co-author of Earth for All, and co-lead of the initiative. And Sandrine, floor is yours. Please kick us off.
Thank you so much, Till. And ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to be with you today. And thank you so much to our colleagues at the Austrian government who are working with us to ensure that Earth for All is translated at the national level. What we really wanted to do today is lead you through the work that we've been doing, not only through Earth for All, but most recently SDG for All. As indicated by Till, there's a real concern as we are now at this halftime point in our stock-taking exercise that we are nowhere where we need to be in terms of the SDGs. And as you will see in our unpacking of the results of SDG for All, it is very clear that indeed we are not where we need to be. So what we've tried to do through our report is to lead to some potential recommendations of what it is that we need to do, linked to our work through Earth for All. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. 50 years ago, we published The Limits to Growth. And that seminal report was fundamental for 2 very key reasons. One was because it was the first true use of system dynamic modeling applied then to thinking through what we were determining as the word limits. Limits to a growing population, limits to a growing population's impact on a finite planet. And we knew that if we continued to grow at the level that we had predicted at that time, that we would actually overshoot Earth's capacity. Now, there is a very small little graph that you can see at the bottom of your screen on the left-hand corner. I think the most important element of that graph is that our scenarios determined that in the 2020s, not in the 1920s, in the 2020s, that we would absolutely start to overshoot the Earth's capacity, and that we would start to see those impacts. Here we are today, living the polycrisis, a polycrisis where we're now talking about a permacrisis, where we know that we're in the midst of a series of environmental and social tipping points. When we decided that we wanted to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth, we knew that we could not celebrate, but we knew that we also could not just come forward with a 21st century doomsday scenario. So we decided collectively to work through the membership of the Club of Rome, esteemed economists and scientists from across the globe, with partners at the Norwegian Business School, at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and also at the Potsdam Institute, apologies, and work together with Johan Rockström as the lead at the Potsdam Institute and our other colleagues in the different institutes to address how we could actually turn that system dynamic model into some new scenarios within a 21st century context. And what Earth for All truly does is it provides a pathway to help steer humanity away from social and ecological catastrophes. The book has now been published in 8 languages. There are 3 languages that are still actually in the waiting room that will be published soon, including Chinese that has already published, English and German. But most importantly, what the book has done is that it's created a movement. It's created a movement with a variety of different audiences, and you will hear about some of the national implementation programs that we're looking at. But also, in addition to the national implementation programs, we've seen a huge movement around the cultural and creative space, where festivals have been created around Earth for All. In the academic space, where many universities are now wanting to integrate Earth for All into their educational programs. Or within even the music space, where the European Youth Symphony has actually converted Earth for All into a symphony. Next slide, please. The basis for the book, however, even though we're seeing this unbelievable creative space and this movement building around Earth for All, the fundamental basis is the paradigm shift that we need within the economic modeling. We need to shift from an extractive GDP-based economy, from pure productivity and extraction of resources, to an economy that takes into account social and environmental risks in financial and economic decision-making, to an economy that is fundamentally based on many of the different models and theories of change, from well-being economics or mission economies, circular and regenerative economies, post-growth and donut economics, which in particular is being applied at the local level, and really shifts us from existing GDP economic paradigms and neoliberal paradigms into a beyond GDP mindset and regulatory framework. What's important here in particular is to take into consideration a few key focal points of this paradigm shift. One is to expand the perspective of public goods, to bring back the importance also of the state, to think through how we reward environmental and social commons. The other is very much anchored in growing inequality, not only between the North and the South, but within economies, and to correct that inequality, and to think through at the international level, what type of international financial and economic infrastructure and architecture do we need to make those shifts? And then the third key point is, how do we diversify our economy? How do we diversify our financial and political thinking? How do we ensure that we give agency to women and back to workers to drive the direction of the economy, to make them empowered, to make them feel that they're part of an economy which has become so over-financialized and transactional that it is only shareholder value that currently counts? Next slide, please. So through that thinking, through that system dynamic modeling, which Natalie will lead you through, we came up with 2 key scenarios that are fundamentally anchored in 5 main turnarounds. Those 2 scenarios are the too little too late scenario, which is basically business as usual, and then the giant leap scenario, which is trying to achieve the fastest economic transformation in history. It is anchored in ensuring that we stay within the planetary boundaries, knowing that we've already overshot 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, as we've seen once again and been reminded this week by the newest report that has come out from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, the Center. Most importantly, it's about keeping us within that central circle of ensuring that we are in a safe operating space. Next slide, please. So those 5 global turnarounds that will enable us to get to the giant leap are ensuring that we transform and accelerate human development in low-income countries by eliminating poverty, by reforming the international financial and trade system, by ensuring that we actually reduce inequality, in particular in countries, by transforming wealth distribution, by ensuring the wealthiest 10% have no more than 40% of national income. Because we've seen through our studies that most of the wealthy hold on to 60 to even 80% of national income in several countries. That we transform the energy system to halve the emissions of greenhouse gases every decade, ensuring that we both look at the supply side as well as the demand side. So both transforming towards renewables and ensuring that we optimize efficiencies, and that we transform our entire agricultural system and our food system to become regenerative and nature positive. It is fundamental that we take into consideration the empowerment of women. The empowerment of women, which will enable us to both ensure that we bring forward education and access to education to women, that we bring women into decision-making roles, but that also, because of the way in which we empower women, we then see a direct decrease in population growth, which will then, of course, enable us to live within the planetary boundaries. Next slide, please. So as Natalie leads you through this very important modeling, I want you to remember one key point. Next slide, please. That the speed of action on planetary boundaries is a function of the speed of action on inequality and poverty. That is the fundamental message that has come out of Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, and all of our work, and now the newest report, SDG for All. So I hope that we will lead you through now this process and that you will understand not only our thinking, but also why it's so important to broaden this movement and this thinking into a broader group of composed actors from a variety of different countries, cultures, sectors, in order to ensure that we indeed do create an Earth for All. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. So now that we've talked about Earth for All, we've taken this work and looked at what does it mean for SDGs for all, basically. And this we have done looking at the global, but also national development, because the global and the context-specific national development needs to be considered when talking about the SDGs. So first of all, I'll give some insights into SDG development on the global level, and this will be supported by my colleague Johanna, who will also talk about policy levers and obstacles to overcome, as well as then we will look into the national level for Austria and Kenya and some results we have so far. These are mostly results that come from modeling work. So these are scenarios based on the global or national models that we have used to look into the scenarios of what potential pathways could look like for the SDG. Looking into the global SDG analysis, we have applied the Earth4, the Earth4 model to analyze the SDGs. What this means is we looked into the 2 scenarios that Sandrine already mentioned, and we wanted to understand what the giant leap and the too little too late scenario would mean in terms of SDG achievement. The uniqueness about this model basically is that unlike other models, it captures a lot of social dynamics that are usually not captured in bigger models or in global models. Often we have huge environmental components in these models and economic components, but social dynamics are underrepresented. In our model, we have a high representation of social dynamics, which makes it really unique and also helps us to understand, like Sandrine pointed out, how important inequality and poverty reduction are if we want to move towards a climate change future we desire, how important inequality and poverty are to tackle actually climate change. Again, there's a giant leap scenario and too little too late scenario. What you can see here is the well-being in the giant leap scenario continuously increases, whereas in the too little too late scenario, it decreases. Not going too much into further detail on these two scenarios for this time being, we will then look into how these two scenarios perform in the SDGs. Like Sandrine pointed out, the 5 turnarounds, poverty, inequality, empowerment, food, and energy, is what really makes the difference in these two scenarios. And what makes the biggest difference is implementing all of them together, because of the synergistic effect you can get, which you won't achieve if you only implement parts of these turnarounds. Briefly talking about the Earth for All system dynamics model, here you don't see the entire model, but one of the aspects which is very important is the dynamics between population, greenhouse gas emissions, which means climate change, and the production capacity, so the economy. It's an integrated model capturing these dynamics of the social system, the environmental system, the climate system, and the economic system endogenously, meaning that you have these dynamics of the social system directly, and the income per person directly affects the environment system and the demand for food and energy, which affects climate change, but also then climate change impacts and environmental damage resulting from it impacts again human well-being, which then again impacts and productivity. So environmental damage doesn't only impact human well-being, but also productivity, which again impacts the production capacity and the population, which again impacts human well-being. So there's a lot of interrelationships here, which are very important to capture. What is also unique about this approach is, it is unique, it's not only that it's combining the social, the economic, and the environmental system, but it also is a long-term modeling approach. So it's not about precise numbers always. It's more trying to understand the dynamics on how the different components relate to each other, like the little graph in the bottom left you saw on your screen that Sandrine presented. How does the population relate to climate change? How does this all relate to production capacity, and how this then affects well-being overall, having an integrated approach to well-being, not just looking at it from an economic perspective. This being said, we looked into the different SDGs. I will present SDGs, 4 SDGs here. The first one being SDG number 1, poverty. Yes, this is a major concern, and this prerequisite, lifting people out of poverty, is prerequisite for actually progressing towards all other SDGs and well-being on the global level. So what we can see here is that in the too little too late scenario, the trend of poverty reduction slows down. So, and this is because inequality increases. So by 2050, we'd still have a poverty population below poverty would still be 20%. However, in the giant leap, we can reduce this number drastically, and the decline is more steep than in the too little too late scenario when it comes to poverty. And the population, the fraction of population living below $6.85 per day is actually only 7%. And this means, what this means in absolute numbers is that if 1 billion fewer people live in poverty than in the too little too late scenario by 2050, would live in poverty by 2050. And this is getting really close to the high threshold set by several different, for example, by the SDG index. So that brings us then to the next one. So poverty, as we said, reducing poverty is prerequisite or very essential for increasing well-being. And well-being although SDG 3 is also a large part about health, we've decided to use the well-being index that was in the model already. So this is composed of different components, including inequality, but also including environmental aspects, as they are very essential for well-being. In the too little too late scenario, well-being drops. And this is because of increased inequality and global warming. Giving this more holistic picture to well-being actually makes us really worse off in the too little too late scenario. Whereas if we manage to implement the 5 turnarounds, we can really have increasing well-being that gets us beyond not only the lower threshold, but also the high threshold. And this is because of the elimination of poverty, lowered warming, and reduced inequality. The next one is SDG 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities. And this is, we decided to go for emissions per person, as emissions are a very important factor when it comes to not only sustainable communities, but also emissions have an impact on the health, emissions have an impact on our production, and so on and so forth. Or they are largely influenced actually by the production. So emissions can give us a really good picture, and emissions per person are very important to understand. So in a too little too late scenario, the emissions slowly trend downward, only getting to past the lower threshold by 2050. And this means the way it is set up is that this will actually mean that we will not be reaching the target of the climate change target of 1.5 or even 2 degrees. So having these emissions in the too little too late scenario, actually, because there's a huge delay related to this, also means that we will not reach any safe space within the planetary boundaries. In the giant leap, we can actually reduce the emissions in the 2040s. We already go down to the high threshold. So we actually managed to reduce emissions drastically. And there are several components feeding into this, one of them being the energy turnaround, but also through the empowerment and through investments in the food sector. There is these are huge reasons why we managed to reduce emissions. Also, redistribution plays a major role here. And what we can see is that the emissions go down drastically, also meaning that in the long term, we are much closer to reaching our targets, although it needs to be said that even in the giant leap scenario, we won't manage to stay below 1.5 degrees, but we will manage to stay below 2 degrees by 2100. So reducing this emission and really bending the curve as soon as possible is very important. Then SDG 7, an SDG that's often the partnership. It's about partnership. And this is an SDG that's also a lot about how can we actually reach it? How can we set up partnerships to achieve the SDGs? And one especially important component here is social tension, and that is because social tension is influencing how well policies and partnerships are formed, how well partnerships are formed, how much partnership is there, but also how well is the governance system, how well can we actually implement these policies that we want, that are needed to transform our economic system. Is there enough trust in the government that these policies are needed? And then is there support from the people? All of this is about social tension as well. And that's why we decided to look into social tension. So what happens in the too little too late scenario is that the current trend of increasing social tension would actually continue, and social tension is increasing significantly, whereas in the giant leap scenario, social tension reduces or reduces to a part, but then stabilizes. We will not, so we will not reach the higher threshold for social tension, but we will manage to have a downward trend in the beginning, and then social tension stabilizes. That being said, there are some, and I will lead over to Johanna, my colleague. There's several findings we had in terms of interventions that needed to be implemented to actually achieve these giant leap SDG scenarios. Johanna.
Thank you, Natalie. Thanks, everybody. And Natalie, if you just want to keep that slide up, that would be great. So I'd like to pick up on the point that Sandrine made before, and that was that the new revelation from both the Earth for All book, but also from our SDGs for All report, is that the speed of action, or the speed of action for planetary boundaries is a direct function of the speed of action on poverty and inequality. So I want to focus on the policy levers for poverty, inequality, and I'll touch on empowerment. I'll leave food and energy aside for the time being. So I'm not going to go over the policy levers that we have identified, but I'm going to share with you the insights that we were able to tease out of our SDGs for All report that really shed light on the political obstacles that are really blocking progress on these key proposals. So let me start first with the whole idea of creating fiscal space. We know that governments are so far off away from their goals for bridging the finance divide. Last year, just to give you an example, the official development assistance that was channeled from donor governments to low-income and middle-income countries was so low it represented 5% of the actual annual needs of low-income countries. So this is an absolutely staggering figure, and it explains why these countries are in the debt crisis that they are. But we know that the money's there because we know that governments were able to mobilize incredible volumes of resources for COVID, for the war in Ukraine, for the banking crisis. So the massive investment that has to come both from public and private channels is absolutely critical. At the same time, we need to ensure that private investment, which is now only flowing primarily to developed countries, starts to flow to developing countries or low-income countries and to those sectors that matter most for the SDGs. Now, when it comes to freeing up fiscal space, many have heard the term special drawing rights that are issued by the International Monetary Fund. So the special drawing rights, the SDRs, they're an international reserve asset. It's an asset that's created by the IMF to basically inject more liquidity into the economy and into the economies of low-income countries. The problem there is that despite a big issuance of over $650 billion in SDRs 2 years ago, the drama is that they were allocated on the basis of IMF voting systems, quota systems. So most of the SDRs went to developed countries who need them the least. But developed countries did agree to rechannel the SDRs to developing countries 2 years ago, but not a single SDR has been channeled thus far. Another reason why we're dealing with a debt crisis that is really turning into a very serious development crisis. On the debt crisis, we know that the G20 set up a special mechanism called the Global Common Framework, and not a single country that's requested debt relief has actually been granted debt relief. And we know that many countries who are highly indebted are spending over 30% of their GDP on debt reservicing. We also know that, and there's another drama, that besides governments who hold much of the debt, there are many private investment firms like BlackRock, a very notorious investment firm that holds the debt of 5 of the largest African countries, and BlackRock has refused systematically to grant debt relief. They are insisting not only in the repayment of the interest, but in the capital as well. And they're profiteering something to the effect of 200% in the last year. The other factor that is really stalled is the ambition to reform the Bretton Woods institutional architecture and the international financial architecture. And we see at summit after summit, be it the G20, the G7, that governments continue to resist the call for a more equitable, a more transparent, a more participatory international financial architecture. I'm going to end with one other important factor. Taxing the rich, wealth taxation is a big part of what we are calling for in terms of generating, mobilizing increased resources. And we know that wealth taxation, a 10% tax can generate a considerable recurring revenue. And I would like to share with you a story, or rather an anecdote. In France last year, many of you recall that the President Macron had tried, and he did successfully, to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. But had he implemented a wealth tax when he came into power 10 years earlier, he would have generated sufficient revenue to fund the entire French pension system. So we know that also wealth taxation is not just important for addressing income inequality in society, which, as Sandrine said, these social tipping points are going to really bite us first. Wealth taxation is a really critical climate mitigation strategy because the richest 1% are the fastest growing source of emissions. On average, their investments result in 1 million times more emissions than an average person living in a low-income country. So we feel that, certainly in 2024 as a critical election year, that the increase in the perceived inequality that is growing around the world, we hope, will ultimately translate into growing demands for redistributive tax policy, and which will be more just and more fair. I'm going to leave it there. There are many other obstacles that we can discuss, but I think that gives you an idea of the obstacles that are really impeding the policy interventions that we are calling for, especially in the poverty, inequality, and empowerment turnarounds. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That's great. And I think we have seen a very good overview that shows that first, social and environmental factors belong together and can't be separated. When we look at the transformation we need not to look at siloed approaches, and we can't afford siloed thinking, but we need system thinking, and we need to see what are the interactions between the social and environmental factors. But we also know, of course, that while Earth for All has suggested certain pathways, and we think it's crucial to think along the 5 turnarounds, we know that the solutions are, of course, different in different countries. And that's why it's so important for us to localize the campaign, to speak about Earth for All in different contexts, and to hear voices from different countries, to see what does an implementation of the socioeconomic transformation look like at different places. And this is why we're so happy to have this collaboration first with Austria, and we will hear much more about that in the second part of the session, but also with Kenya. And therefore, I'm very, very pleased to introduce my colleague Jane Mariara, who's Executive Director of the Partnership for Economic Policy, a member of the Transformational Economics Commission of the Club of Rome, and our local partner of the implementation of Earth for All in Kenya. And pleasure to have you here, Jane, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I have been introduced. My name is Jane Mariara. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Economic Policy. The subject of the day has been introduced and the context set. So I'm going to be speaking over the next 10 minutes or so on the implementation of the Earth for All's national engagement strategy in Kenya, which we are reading under the Partnership for Economic Policy. Let me see that I can move my slides. So very quickly, just to first tell you that PEP Partnership for Economic Policy is a Southern-led group organization that is dedicated to supporting locally-led development in the Global South. We are headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, but we work in the entire Global South. So on that map that you see there, those are the countries where we've supported research and policy engagement, capacity building, and deepening of policy engagement over the last 22 years or so. Our core focus now, although we are global, we've worked a lot in Africa, covering about 46% of the projects. One other thing that we pride in, and I think resonates with what has been mentioned earlier, is our focus on strengthening women researchers, policymakers who are almost non-existent. And so almost half of our researchers are women. Well, about 80% of our staff are actually women. And also just to mention that we have built capacity for more than 1,000 researchers in the Global South. Basically what we do and how it connects to the Earth for All program, we have a strong focus on, among other things, building bridges between research and policy so that we don't have the silos where we generate research and then it does not impact on the ground. And also we do try to boost project feasibility and ensure that those projects have impacts on policy, ensuring that there's good uptake of policy by the relevant stakeholders, especially government. And then finally, creating connections for knowledge sharing across the globe. And that is why one of the things that we really looking for into is how we create connections of knowledge sharing related to Earth for All messages in Kenya. And hopefully later we can contribute to driving those messages across Africa and also supporting the other countries that will be doing this. Quickly giving a quick context of how the Earth for Work All maybe relates to the Kenyan context. First, I would want to look at the whole issue of the government agenda related to sustainable development goals and other policies. And I would want to note that first, at the moment, the government is very apt on what it's calling the bottom-up economic transformation agenda or the better agenda, knowing that really we need to start from the grassroots, focus on the people who are the grassroots so that then we can amplify the policies from the bottom to the up. And through this better agenda, the government is committed to turning around the economy. So maybe we could connect this to what we are talking about in Earth for All, how we reboot our economic system, uplifting the lives and livelihoods of the poorest of the poor. So this now again connects to what we have in the Earth for All in terms of improving the living standard issues, and the focus of the government to ensure that we can achieve this better agenda is on agriculture, medium, small, and micro enterprises, because a lot of people work in the informal sector, are self-employed. There's the issue of providing decent housing, decent and affordable housing for the, especially for the very poor. Provision of basic health care, affordable and accessible health care, and the digital economy, which, as we know, is really a panacea to grow that development. Then one thing that the government has done, or we can say very well, is that the 17 SDGs goals for Kenya are mapped within the government policy Vision 2030, the blueprint. We have what we call the third and fourth medium-term plans, which really are meant to help us implement the policies in Vision 2030. And as we all know, the Africa Agenda 2063, the government is really bringing all this together. Now, related to the SDGs, and I'll be brief on this, I think we've been given a very good context, especially Johan, the last speaker, has brought it at a broad level, but looking at Kenya, perhaps at where this analysis should go, we are discussing the indicators with the Millennium Institute and the government of Kenya. We see that the key issues that we have looking at, maybe starting with SDG 1, the poverty rates in Kenya, we find rising poverty instead of poverty going down. We know we had made good progress pre-COVID, but with the effects of COVID and perhaps the almost triple global financial crisis or global crisis that are going on, we find that actually poverty is increasing. I don't have the estimates for 2023, but we see that over the COVID period, for instance, poverty already increased by, over that period, 2016 to 2021, more than 2%. Then, of course, there's the very high population growth rate. I know there's the debate whether COVID actually did moderate the growth rates of the population, at least not in most African countries, because we know that the death rates from COVID were not that high. So Kenya still has a population of about 50.6 million, growing at about 4%. And then related to SDG 2, there's the issue of severe food insecurity, which is still very high. And actually estimated that by 2021, maybe almost 70% of the population were food insecure. So this is really something that needs to be tackled. And related to Earth for All, we note that the effects of climate change is a major contributor. And we know that the usual suspects, a lot of flooding, prolonged drought periods are not helping. Then related to SDG 4, issue of inclusive education, we know that there are gains that have been made in education. The government is doing a lot, maybe in terms of, for instance, what we call the TVETs, trying to digitalize education, trying to ensure there's free basic education. But we find that there are still challenges that such as the completion rates. Digitalization is still very low and very unequal, something that really came up during COVID, whereby the urban children could still continue with schooling, but not the rural areas because of connectivity. And then the literacy rates, proficiency is still very low. Then relating to SDG 8, decent work to achieve economic growth, maybe the highlight there, I would still maybe pick up on the very high unemployment rates, female unemployment rates even higher, and very worrisome is the youth unemployment rate, which stood at 35% last year. And finally, of course, the bulk of the economy is relying on the informal employment, which is not a problem so long as we have policies that can support that informal employment. And then maybe finally on the SDGs, maybe quickly looking at 3 SDGs, which are very related to the work of Earth for All, is the challenges for clean water and sanitation, that is SDG 6, affordable clean energy, SDG 7, and then the climate action, SDG 13. And of course, we still have issues of access to clean and safe drinking water, access to safe sanitation, a real problem with only with more than 70% not having half. And the issue of clean fuels and technologies for cooking. This is a real problem with only about 20% having access to clean fuels. And one of the things that I would say is that the high cost of electricity have been actually, electricity and energy have been a real driver of inflation in Kenya. So basically what I would say is that the key barrier to climate action is inadequate mechanisms for climate change monitoring. I think one of the things we need is climate change monitoring, verification, and reporting. and then also maybe gathering enough information about green technologies and so forth. And this is something that maybe we need stakeholders to work together. So finally, with this, and of course, many others, because we are still discussing the key indicators that we need to look into together with the Millennium Institute, so that once we are doing the model and the report, we are kind of very comprehensive, tying this to what we are doing for the work, for all work. What we note, as I've already alluded to, is that I think the Kenyan economy was doing very well pre-COVID. And even now, though maybe in 2020, 2021, there was almost a slump in the economy because of COVID, then started improving before the recent crisis came in. I think we've seen the interconnectedness between the global and the local dynamics. And what we are talking about in Earth for All is not any different for Kenya. But the beauty is that the government of Kenya is committed to realize the SDGs with a focus on mobilizing financial resources, technical experts, and also local and international cooperation. And what we are doing with the Earth for All program for Kenya is to leverage on this commitment by the government. So we are ready to support the government to contextualize the 5 turnarounds that have been discussed earlier today, and to accelerate the achievement of the SDGs, the Kenya Vision 2030 and Agenda 2063 for Kenya. So PEP, Partnership for Economic Policy, is of course leading the engagement for Kenya, as we have already said. And in leading this engagement, then what we are doing, as Natalie has presented, as Millennium Institute does the core analysis for Kenya, we backstop the Millennium Institute together with the government, the SDG Coordination Directorate in Kenya. We are working together and asking maybe 3 key questions: the implications of adopting either the two-rate scenario for Kenya, what that will mean for well-being, inequality, addressing social tensions, and then how can we find pathways to reboot our economic system to achieve prosperity for all, and then the implications of our blueprints. As I finish, there are 4 pillars of the national engagement in Kenya. Research has already been discussed. Maybe I don't need to emphasize that, but what I need to emphasize is that we will be facilitating citizen engagement, building alliances, stakeholder groups, driving public engagement for future scenarios. We'll be conducting advocacy work to foster a shift away from focus on GDP towards a well-being economy. And then we'll be undertaking outreach and public campaigns for the just and sustainable economic system. And we'll be working on the principles of understanding the local circumstances, engaging with local partners, including the unheard voices, of course, bringing together scientific experts and citizen engagement. We can't do it alone. We can't do it just with the Millennium Institute, a Club of Rome, Earth for All, but really we'll be calling upon to work with everyone who has a stake in this, who is interested in this. We want to explore how this work would eventually lead to multilateral and international cooperation. We want to upscale the simulations and engagement, of course, related to other African countries. That's really the objective of all this. And finally, we are calling all of you, all the stakeholders, to rally behind this initiative for Kenya, for Austria, and for many other countries that will be doing this in the future. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jane, for this presentation. And as you said at the beginning, we see the global challenges, we see the global crisis, but we see the manifestation of it very differently at different places. Secretary General Guterres said earlier this week, only 15% of the targets of the SDGs are on track, and many are going in reverse. We have seen that in Professor Mariara's presentation on related to poverty, but of course we see that it looks different at different places, and that's why it's also so important for Earth for All to look at different economies, to work with different local partners, and that's why we're so excited about our collaboration with Austria as well. And in that context, I'm very happy to introduce Franz Fehr, who is chair of Uninet's Council, University of Natural Resources and Life Science based in Vienna, and speaking to us about the Austrian context. And thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours, Franz.
I'm very happy to be here. Also, thank you from my side to Kappa From and all the people that were working on this session. I try to share my presentation slides. I will now speak about the implementation of SDGs in Austria from a scientific view. It's a scientific project, and the 5 turnarounds of the Kappa From Earth for All project should also be brought to the ground with this project. First, about the structure and the idea of the project. The origin of Uninet's project was an initiative of the Ministry of Science from Austria and the Alliance of Sustainable Universities in Austria. At the first step, we did a mapping of all SDG research activities in Austria. We mapped the scientific publications about SDGs in Austria in the last 6 years. And the second step, so we found out who are the relevant researchers in Austria. And the second step, we did a formation of 17 interdisciplinary teams of scientists to work on each SDG together. So the hard facts about the Uninet's project were about 300 scientists from 20 scientific institutions, about 16 universities. You see them, the pictures of the main houses on here on the slide. Therefore, we were able to bring 30 scientific disciplines together and performing new creativity. And we've got 2 performance periods. Uninet's 1 was working 2019 to 2021. And now we're in period 2, Uninet's 2, 2022 to 2024. How do we work together? As I said, we made 17 teams for each SDG 1, and you see here at the first row the 17 SDGs pictures, and in the first column you see the universities and scientific institutions working there, and all the points show the science, which universities and institutions brings the scientists into the team. So we got teams with about 2 or 3 institutions, but we also got, as you can see on SDG 4, with about 15 institutions working together. So we're combining interdisciplinary skills. We also work transdisciplinary, so we also try to get stakeholders from politics, from NGOs, from business into our teams to get the know-how on the ground, and therefore we create spaces for art and creativity. We also, you may hear more later, University of Applied Arts and other art academies in our team. The main milestones of Uninet's 1 project had been 2 main publications. The first was the perspective report. There we made a stock taking and looked about the indicators of the SDGs that are relevant for Austria. As next step, we elaborated about 1,000 proposals for measures together with stakeholders for Austrian decision makers to implement the SDGs. After we worked out these measures, we made an assessment of the interaction between these measures and the SDG targets, as well as the interactions of the measures themselves. And we also looked at the direct and the spillover effects. the result of that was then the main publication of UNINETS 1. It was the options report. We wrote for the Austrian federal government and presented them with 4 ministers. Now the second period of UNINETS, we've got a transformative agenda. We try to do transdisciplinary dialogue with decision makers from politics, from public administration, economy, civil society, as well as regional and local actors to get our options in the options report on the ground. And some examples for our work are the cooperation with the national parliament, where we show all the politicians in the Austrian parliaments each month the ideas from us for one SDG. So it's about for 17 months along when we are in the parliament. Then we do workshops with the interministerial working group on the implementation of the SDGs. And we've got a dialogue with the sustainability coordinators of the federal states of Austria. So how do we work in UNINETS together now as scientists? You see now a matrix again where we got these 17 columns for the SDG teams. And we got now 5 new teams for key areas of transformational science. The team 1 is for transdisciplinary dialogue. The second team is for the implementation and monitoring of the suggested measures. The team 3 is for inter-university research. Team 4 is for teaching, and team 5 is very special. We were focused on governance, as well as governance of universities and governance for society with the focus of transformation. So taking a critical look on what we did so far and what we learned from our project, there's, to my mind, unexpected high interest of stakeholders on our work on the SDGs, on the scientific view on SDG implementation in Austria. But there are quite a lot of problems in understanding and communicating with each other. Science and external stakeholders speak different languages. If you see to social sciences, natural sciences, technicians or artists. And so we all, and that's to me amazing, we all have to get out of our comfort zone to bringing the SDGs on the ground and accelerate this transformation of society. The factual situation and approaches are relatively clear, so we all know what to do. But the central problems are about cultural change and the priority setting in politics. So where should the money go and where should all the power go? And there, especially for scientists, there's an ethical question for the societal transformation, and also the related need for transformative science. So to resume, it's very much our project started with a scientific view on the problems, and we worked out detailed measures. But as far as we're working, we see that it's really about awareness raising, about the necessity of the SDGs, and also the necessity of acceleration implementing the SDGs. It's about creating concern and shared responsibility in our society. It's about driving societal transformation forward. And as I thought, the ethical tension, especially for science, is between the liberty of science, so to look at problems as you like to, and on the other hand side, the mission for science to contribute to the prosperous development of society. That's now our main focus. So I tried to speed up because we're a little late in time, and thank you now for your attention, and yeah, looking forward to your question.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Franz. And I think this is a very good example also what we have heard now both from Jane and from Franz, how different parts of the work we do, including science, including civil society, including engagement and advocacy, all belong together if we want to master this transformation. And as we have heard a lot of input now, and we heard from Kenya, we heard from Austria, and we heard how this is related on a global level as a systemic issue and as a holistic viewpoint. I'm sure that there are comments or maybe questions from the audience, something you want to contribute, something you want to ask, and give a little bit of a conversation starter. So we will have some time for that before we move into some short music and then to the next session. But sometimes it's important to open the space as well. So please feel free to ask any questions in the chat or raise your hand. You can do that both via in real life or virtually via the emoji button on the bottom. So please feel free to comment or ask anything should you have any questions. Everyone is very much invited to do so.
But I would actually have a question. I was wondering a bit about how you measure, I mean, it's for Natalie and Joe and Johanna and Sandrine. How do you measure the progress on if you are on the way towards the giant leap? I mean, directly on the ground. Do you just go from the system dynamic thing, like you have these figures and numbers, or do you really have something substantial where you can say, okay, now we are on the way towards the right direction, or is there anything else like that? I'm just curious, maybe.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Mike. And maybe we start with Natalie from the modeling perspective on measurement of progress. You want to go on, Natalie?
Yeah, thanks. Measuring of progress. I mean, the thing is, you can look at it like there are certain indicators that we have looked into, right? For example, population below a certain threshold of below $6.58 per day, or the number of people, or you look at into how much emissions or degrees of warming we have in the different scenarios, and then you can see whether the developments go towards, rather the values that we can measure tend to go rather towards one scenario or the other scenario. But as this is not very short-term modeling, it's more about the dynamics in the long term. It will not be able to say this like every year. We can't say next year, oh, we're on this track or on that track. Like for the limits to growth, what we've seen is basically, for example, that you couldn't really say in the beginning which path you were on, but now that we have this data for several years, and I mean, you could have done it after 10 years, you've seen it, but it's not a yearly thing that you can measure, right? Although there are some trends that you can observe. So you can look into what the trend looks like, but not that we can say next year, oh, we're on this path or that path. It's a more like longer time horizon.
Thank you, Natalie. Franz, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to pose a question to Sandrine and Johanna. To my mind, I would be interested about the idea of the giant leap, and to my mind, there's the how to say, the possibility that people might be overstrained by the idea of a really big strains, and I would like to know what they think about. To me, it's just clear that we need a giant leap, but it's all about motivation and not overstraining people, especially the politicians, maybe.
No, very good. And maybe I can start answering that, because I think I'm not sure if Johanna is still here. But maybe I think what first of all, what we did in Earth for All compared to Limits to Growth is exactly to not overwhelm people, to work with 2 scenarios and not 12 as the Limits to Growth did, right? I mean, they throw out 12 scenarios, but everyone focused on doomsday and apocalypse and said Club of Rome says the end of the world is in the year 2000 or the oil is running out in 10 years. And I think that led to a situation through which Limits to Growth was probably one of the most misinterpreted books in the 20th century. So learning from that experience, we came up with only 2 scenarios. And already expressing in the language, not calling it business as usual, which sounds like the normal way forward, but already expressing that it's too little too late if we just continue on the current pathway. And I think there are some people saying that actually business as usual is a utopian option now, because that's something we really can't afford, and the really necessity is to take the giant leap. And I think what I understand the feeling of it's such a massive transformation, but I feel like people do have that feeling and notice that a massive transformation is needed. And I think what Earth for All then does is propose certain policies on the vision to get there. It's not just throwing out a giant leap and now deal with it, but it's rather saying it is possible, and there are certain measures that look differently at different places, but it is possible. And I always feel like, at least for me, having concrete points of action and concrete intervention points, and seeing that we have a massive climate crisis, but actually we need a reform of our financial system, as Joe mentioned, to put out technical stuff like SDR reforms. I think that is something that actually gives more hope and feasibility than just throwing out a normative issue on a long-term thing, which can be overwhelming. And I agree, but I think probably the world is overwhelming anyways, and trying to suggest concrete measures might be a step towards that. But I saw that Natalie raised her hand as well. Maybe others want to say something to that question too, because I think it's very good.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to add to this what we've seen. So having said that models are just simplifications of and representation, right? I think though what we have managed to do is come up with an internally consistent model that can test scenarios in different pathways. And what we see is that if we have the different policies together, actually, it's much more effective than trying to have them spread out individually, right? And the combination of policies is much more effective. And even though it looks overwhelming, doing one at a time will not give you the result that you can achieve if you put them together. And I think that's what we need to realize, is the systemic implications of it, because the sum, so the whole is more than the sum of its parts. It's a very common saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe last point on that, I think what is also motivating is that the end goal of Earth for All, as I mentioned, is not kind of let's prevent apocalypse, but it's increase well-being for all. And I think that is an important thing, right? That we see, like, even by we exploit our planet and all of that, but that even that is not leading to increased well-being. While the planet is burning, people are feeling burned out. And I think that this is a step to say it's not only about the environmental crisis, it's about a good life on a finite planet. And I think that's the vision we have to paint more. Micah, I see your hand is up.
Thank you very much for the answer, and until really gives me hope. Really, it's a good idea to come. I mean, we're all talking about well-being. So I have a question for Jane. Maybe I did not get this right, but I was really interested about your community-based or bottom-up idea. Do you already work with these kind of methods for your research, or do you have any idea or good examples or cases you'd like to share with us in this regard? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mirka. Sorry, I had missed that. Actually, what we are calling the beta approach, the bottom-up approach, is actually a government agenda where they want to start thinking about development from the grassroots going up. And what I'm saying is that I think this is also very important for the Earth for All, because what we are talking about is that how do we reach the indigenous community starting from up, so then we can see how we are going to link up the government agenda to what we are doing for the Earth for All. I mean, in terms of the Earth for All messages. So as PEP, personally, we do not do that. Our work is, the strength that we are bringing in here is mostly the policy engagement, the stakeholder engagement, but then we are going to do it together with the government, and therefore we must start from the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Very good. Good. There's a question, I don't know, Natalie, in the chat, if you want to briefly refer to that. The question is, why does the social tension index oscillate? So you want to go for that?
Yes, thank you. So social tension is very much related to inequality and poverty, and that then relates back to economic developments. And although the model is focused on long-term trends, it also captures the oscillation of the economy over time. So of the economy, there is an assumption that the economy follows cycles in itself, and there is a general overall long-term trend, but in there you have approximately 10-year cycle trends where the economy also goes up and down. So there is this assumption in the model, which then translates into social tension. And that's important to realize, because this can have, the short term might have implications for the long term, but overall, the general overall trend isn't really affected by this, even though we have this oscillation in the shorter term in the economy.
Super. Thank you, Natalie.